Welcome. It has just gone 10 p.m. at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Monday the 28th of August, and you are watching episode 102 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Ministry of Truth, not just a 1984 fiction, is my guest, federal member for Monash, the Honourable Russell Broadbent. Russell is one of Australia's most enduring politicians to come from small business. First entering the fray as a councillor for the Victorian Pakenham Shire in 1980, and was the unsuccessful Liberal candidate for Stretton in 1984 and 87. He then went on to win Cronulla in 1990. The growing Melbourne outer suburbs of the Eastern Corridor proved political volatile, being subject to redistributions, and Russell was in and out of Parliament till 2004, but he has been a constant figure ever since. Welcome, Russell.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be with you. Great for your business people.
Before we get started, if you could just give us a bit of background. I mean, you've been a very enduring politician and a very persistent one, I would say. You entered the political sphere for politics in a time of the successful Hawke and Keating administration, and I suppose at that time it would have been pretty hard for the other side of politics to get in it then, because they did have a pretty good grip on the political scene in the 80s. Can you tell us about that period? Because it's an interesting time to come into politics from the other side, if you get my point.
Yeah, Bill, it's 40 years this year, 2023, since I first entered the fray for pre-selection in 1983. And that 40 years has been a most interesting time, being elected in 1990, as you said, and out in 93, back in 96 and out in 98. Both of those were GST election campaigns, and I was in very marginal seats at the time. I had 6 years out of the Parliament, so I had 3 years out of the Parliament, then 6 years out of the Parliament, came back in 2004, pre-selected in 2003 for 2004 election campaign. And I was expected that I would be the first member deleted from the Parliament again at the next election campaign because of my narrow margin. And I actually increased my margin in the 2007 election campaign. That's mostly because we stood up for people that could not speak for themselves. We stood up for farmers who had been denied drought relief here. We were able to deliver that for them. That was very important in my electorate, because I say, if you're not accepted in the cattle yard at the cattle sales, you can't win this seat. Simple as that. So farmers and women of Australia, they decide who governs the country, and they decide whether I stay in my seat or not. And all the way through to the last election, whereby I managed, Bill, to be offside with every leader because I stood up for people all the time. Rather than the party, I stood up for the people. And I look back and I wouldn't do anything differently than I'm doing then and I did today on this misinformation, disinformation bill, for instance.
Well, I think the general consensus now is that the farmers are getting well and truly bashed on all sides, from environmentalists to now the new renewable energy. And that goes for just regional Australia as well. We seem to bear the brunt of policies that are designed in the major capital cities to harvest the best chance of winning those huge numbers of seats that are centred around the nation's different capitals. Is this bill any different, or does it have a wider scope? Because it's the stuff of democracy is the stuff of supposed to be free speech, and this seems to go against all the those pillars of democracy.
Well, it's very similar to what happened to the farmers in Western Australia on the Indigenous land bill that they brought in, and now they're stepping back from because of the backlash. But and I also go to the influence of what's happening overseas, and I'll tell you why I'm doing that. Coles and Woolies are being directed by the European community there as to what their farmers should be doing in Australia and the decarbonising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, they are calling the shots. So if you want to deal with us, you have to agree to what Europe's demanding there, which hasn't been the Australian way. It's un-Australian. We like to be clean and green and the best in the world. And we already are. They know it, but they still want us to bow down to what the European Economic Community is deciding what is best for the world and therefore Australia. This misinformation, disinformation bill is not dissimilar to bills right across the world. In other words, it's a worldwide movement to stifle free speech. And what did the Australian Human Rights Commissioner say, who are normally silent on these issues till after legislation's introduced? And she said, this is remarkable, Lorraine Finlay, she's warned that Labor's proposed laws to combat online misinformation could undermine democracy, erode public trust, and jeopardise free speech.
Well, that's an unusual position from someone of that side, because they're usually siding with minorities to the nth degree, and the majority can lump it or like it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for her to come out, it is unprecedented in my memory for the Human Rights Commission to come out before a bill is introduced to Parliament. So it's a big call for her, and she is spot on. Now, where we say, does this affect regional? Absolutely, it affects regional people, because a lot of our information that we require comes from our use of the internet and social media and that interaction. And what they're saying now is, look, Bill, we're saying to you, the government's saying to you, we will decide what is truth and what is not truth. And if you don't conform to what we want, in other words, the social media platforms would become totally and absolutely bereft of anything that the government didn't want out there, or the narrative the government was then proposing. Now, to me, that's absolutely frightening, because I get my information from all sorts of sources. I do not just rely on mainstream media, as most of our young people do not rely on mainstream media anymore. In fact, many people will be going to your program to hear the truth about what's going on. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Parliament Joint Committee on Human Rights. I'm so pleased to hear that the Human Rights Commissioner has come out and said this will undermine democracy, erode public trust, and jeopardise free speech. In her own words, that's what this will do. So why would a government want to introduce that? And remember that old argument about, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you don't have to worry. Well,
but the thing is, how did Australia get to this? This is the real concerning thing. We went through COVID, and we've all suffered that experience, and had the messaging out there from the government day in, day out, what was and wasn't. To be obeyed to the nth degree and enforced, and fairly brutally sometimes, and especially down in Melbourne at times. And then we had things like Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand, basically speaking, you need to go to our websites to get the truth. You need to go to the government to get the truth, as though the government is the only vehicle for truth. And nothing can be further from the fact in regards to, if you look at governments worldwide, none of them have got a great record of being fully truthful and accountable.
Yeah, well, she stood up and said, the only truth you can believe is the truth that I'm giving you.
Well, we certainly can't depend on people like Ardern anymore. But the other thing is, where did the Liberal Party sit on this? Because I vaguely remember some talk about this some years ago on a similar sort of means when the Liberals were in power. So has the fight back by the Liberal Party and the Nationals been strong enough, do you think?
Well, it is now, but apparently we were going to introduce similar legislation, internationally driven by Paul Fletcher, some 2 years ago. But it never came to the party room, Bill. It never came.
Okay, I knew there was something out there, but it was never really clear cut.
No, it was never discussed. And had it been at the time, there would have been an outroar within the party room, because whether you believe the misinformation, disinformation on the narrative of COVID or not, and you were seen as a conspiracy theorist if you said this virus came out of a Wuhan lab, and that wasn't the government's narrative. So that was just taken down, of course. But if you had said that at that time, you were a conspiracy theorist, and worse than that, you were spreading misinformation, which I was accused of on another issue. I asked about excess deaths in Australia. This month, the new figures that have come out for February of 23 says that we've had another 2,500 excess deaths in Australia. I mean, so in the first few months, we've had 8,000, just over about 450 a week of more people dying than is normal in Australia, right? If you have an abnormality of 1 or 2% in health, you can say, oh, it's a monthly dip or high with the figures. But if you have, this is a black swan event when you have a 15% discrepancy. Now, I put that similar out in a parliamentary speech, 5-minute parliamentary speech, and I only asked the question, is the health minister looking at why this is happening in Australia and around the world? And I put that speech up on YouTube, and it was taken down because it was misinformation. I wasn't following the narrative. It was taken down. It wasn't in the community interest. Well, excess deaths in Australia not being in the community interest, if that's not in the community interest, what is in the community interest?
So amongst your colleagues, how much is the alarm bells ringing on this and our future in regards to free speech? Because when the Constitution was written, obviously our forefathers went and had an opportunity to look at other constitutions. And I think one of the shortcomings was they obviously didn't look at all the amendments to the US Constitution, which put in things like free speech, because free speech actually isn't in our constitution, but we think it's a given. How do we sort of look to address this in the future so this can't keep coming back and biting us?
Well, governments of the day no, let me say this. Mainstream media will be exempt from these laws, but not people like yourself who are not mainstream media. So it's the general thrust of government and those in power not to hand over that power that can go to regional rap. They want you to stay in their court, not in regional rap's courts with Bill Gates and guests. So you will be caught under this legislation, but mainstream media won't be, as long as they're running the government narrative too. So, and remember, mainstream media gets a lot of their money from government through advertising. So, there we go. Who's pushing it around the world? I don't know what's happening in my party. Yes, we went from benign opposition, I would call it, now to kill the bill. And what happened was I firstly wrote to Peter Dutton and said, this isn't on. And I was very strident towards him in regard to the values that the party that he leads now represents. It's in our party platform, our statement of beliefs. So I ran down the statement of beliefs and I said, and here is how this bill will offend that statement of beliefs. I got a reasonable response, but so it wasn't good enough for me. I wrote to every parliamentarian because, as you said, Bill, I've been around a while. I know what to do. I wrote to every parliamentarian, Prime Minister, to every backbencher. And then I got a response from Peter Dutton, which is far stronger. It's now been to the party room. It was fantastic, Bill. I didn't have to say a word in the party room because everybody else wanted to have a go.
Well, that's so really encouraging.
Yeah. So you can do a lot from the powerless position of a backbencher, as Wilson Tuckley often taught me.
The other thing is too, is it's very worrying, the outside... Sorry about that.
All right.
That's my tech guy. That's my tech guy coming on telling me he's ready. Is it worrying that outside influences on almost every facet of our life and political life in Australia is overtaking our sovereignty in regards to from climate change to the way we do business in farming and all that, and now this push into our freedom of speech. Andrew, do you think there's a serious problem in all these facets, and how will we ever counter that if we as a small population nation have very dependent on imports and our interaction with our global partners? Are we going to continue, or how are we going to sort of redress this in the future, or can't we?
It's very hard to turn back a rolling stone of this magnitude. That is, as you say, encroaching on every facet of Australian life. It doesn't matter whether it's farming, whether it's education, whether it's our values, our family values, the values of our party, the values that make Australia great, fair go for all, free speech, the rule of law, common law, where we stand on these issues, what is right and what is wrong. What used to be wrong is now seen to be right, and what to me is right is now seen to be wrong. So the world has changed dramatically from my boyhood till now. It's been a dramatic change. Some will say for the better. I will say that we are encroached on every level right across this nation by influences that are not of our own making. And I referred to Coles and Woolworths and their implementation of their programs with our farmers to farm in such a way that suits them, that gives them credibility overseas. Credibility for what? Are they doing it any better than us? I don't think so. And I think that there are farmers here that they should be running the world, not the world running them. How can we turn it around? I think we have to be eternally vigilant the whole time on everything we sign up to, every treaty we sign up to. We should be very careful about every treaty we sign up to.
Well, that's another worry. We don't seem to have a system where we can sort of counter some of these agreements. We've had the federal governments, of course, is responsible for signing up the treaties, but we've been sort of signing up to every treaty for the UN since ever. And no one seems to object. Do you think we need another mechanism in regards to, before a treaty can be signed, at least the state government sign off it, or the premiers or something, to at least slow it down a bit? Because not all treaties seem to treat us very fairly.
That's why we don't sign up. That's why it was very good the government did not sign up to the latest free trade agreement when we were going to give away our right to call certain wines certain names in Australia. And because our sovereignty played a greater role there on behalf of our farmers and our wine growers. So we would not sign up to something that took away our benefit and our right to sell a product under a certain name that has been sold under that name for years. Now, we have signed up to agreements like that, Bill, before, to our great detriment, not to our great benefit. So there is a political and there is an economic cost for us to stand up against unfair demands in a free trade agreement. We're best off, in my view, without the free trade agreement. You know, like our farmers, when faced with a ban from China, we went out and found new markets and sold all of the product. It didn't go to China. Now, whether we sold it to one country and then they sold it on to China, we don't know. But what we do know is we stood up to China on that ban on grain. We sold that elsewhere. In the wine industry, no, we haven't got every opportunity back from China, but we have sold a lot of wine elsewhere in the world. And even though our red wine growers have had a terribly, terribly tough time, they're still there. They're still there.
That trade is one thing. Other sort of things that we've signed up to, with the UN in particular, just take for instance the going back to '86, the Convention for Children. It introduced a number of points, but as a country, we already, and I understand why it was brought in because of the situations in Africa and things like that, where people were the children soldiers at the time. But our children already had a great benefit and didn't need that sort of coverage. Do you think we just go into these things without looking what the other problems that we might introduce to our own domestic situation, especially when we're further advanced than what the conditions were at the time for children in Africa and other countries?
Yeah, well, the Convention on the Rights of a Child was very important at those times. It affects all sorts of areas. And one of them is the protection of a right to life. Child has a right to life. And you can have your own views on abortion. Everybody can have their views on abortion. But, you know, the fact is that convention defends the unborn child as well. So, Bill, it's things like the World Health Organization at the moment is asking us to sign our sovereignty on international health response over to them. So they would direct what we would and wouldn't do during a next pandemic outbreak. Now, we haven't signed that yet, but if we say nothing, it's tantamount to signing it. So there's a treaty that we enter into, and all we remain is silent.
Yeah.
So it's worse that, and that to me is worse. You should have to, if they want you to enter into a health agreement that can affect the daily lives of every Australian, and you do it by saying nothing, I think that's where Australia needs to step in and say, no, we are not signing up to that until we agree that we will sign up to that. And that's not the case at the moment. It's just a matter of they set the time frame for these rules to go through, they go through, and then we're bound by them, internationally bound by them. It's incredible stuff. I'm only learning a lot about it now.
Well, that's to me sounds ridiculous. I mean, you know, nowhere else do you enter into a contract unless you actually sign something and agree to it. So
That's correct.
that's a real strange situation. Do you think the other thing is because we've? Do you think the Australian public is too apathetic in regards to understanding or even being interested or getting a grip on a lot of these things that have come through? Because it seems to me we should be getting, ordinary people should be getting very angry in regards to what's being dictated in their life. But we seem to be Australians seem to be very passive, conform to whatever the line or the narrative that the government's pushing out on a daily basis, especially with COVID. That, I mean, I'm a person, one of the things my dad always told me, believe nothing you hear and only half of what you see. So I've been a skeptic from since a kid, but it's getting to the stage where pretty hard to even believe some of the things that you can see, considering what they can actually do with imagery these days. And so I didn't get vaccinated. I sort of had the issue with a lot of different aspects of lockdowns and things like that. But it did cause a lot of friction in my family. I come from Western Australia. I've got family over Western Australia, and even they're divided. You know, I've got one sister who thought the thing was a problem, and other sister and their family who thought McGowan, you know, was sort of some sort of god for saving them all. So it's making it very hard for ordinary people to get a grip if we don't have any real guidance in the future from people who should know better in the government.
Well, I make no judgment on McGowan or any of the decisions that they made. They were being internationally driven, I would say again. They believed the narrative. They believed the lockdowns worked. What actually happened, though, was the lockdowns, as far as we know, didn't stop the transmission. The mandates didn't stop the transition. And the so-called vaccines didn't stop anybody getting the disease or dying. Yet they will say, but we saved millions around the world with these vaccines. Well, the funny part about that is you don't normally vaccinate during a pandemic. If you're going to vaccinate, you vaccinate for an illness before the people get it. And they're still getting it. You know, people who have been vaccinated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times are still getting COVID. You work it out.
And it must be.
I've given up arguing the point. I've given up arguing. I'm not vaccinated, as you know.
But the thing is, what I'm trying to point out is it actually sets, what's happened has actually set people in the same family, you know, against each other, sort of thing.
And that was right across Australia, Bill.
And it's very concerning, and it should be something that even the government in general looks at. Again, how do you have issues that divide things, actual families and that? Does it need to be looked at? Does the whole issue need looked at and done better? But
well, hopefully the antagonism between family members over this issue will subside over time. Time's a great healer. But I took a stand. I would have taken a stand naturally anyway, because I had a gynecologist, a GP, and a former GP come and see me and say, don't take them. And my own health practitioner said, don't take them. You know, so mine was a very clear decision I took on behalf of my own well-being. My family are vaccinated. Nothing, you know, I could only take a leave. So it wasn't just in your family, it's in every family. There are divisions over policy issues many times. This one was just very much out there. And I really feel for people who did not want to take these jabs, but had to do it to keep their job. and now of telling me it's cost them very dearly their health. So it's up to people to make up their own minds what they do and how they do it. But it worries me to think these RNMA vaccines are about to go into our cattle and therefore into our meat. And that would be very sad from my point of view.
I think one of the other things is, although this bill doesn't affect the mainstream media, I would expect journalists in general should be rallying against this as well. If you go back to the institution, which was formerly called the Fourth Estate, which basically the term came out of the French Revolution, when the press held the people in power to account. And that was fairly commonplace right up to 50s and 60s, that the media was fiercely independent of government. And we had heaps of investigative journalists bringing issues to light, speaking their mind, being aware that protecting free speech, mindful of things like, of course, defamation and slander laws. Do you think we can do anything to redress the situation with mainstream media to get them to do their basic real job?
Well, Adam Creighton from The Australian did a great job, but he was practically run out of town because he wasn't following the narrative. I mean, he had death threats and all sorts of things, to the point where he had to change his phone number and change his address. I mean, even his parents were under attack because he didn't follow the narrative. And he's still not following the narrative, but he was very much the lamb in the wilderness, because he was brave enough to say there's another way of looking at this. Well, the whole of the rest of the mainstream media, you've got to remember, they were paid and directed to follow the narrative. An ABC journalist admitted to me the other day she was told to stick with the narrative and nothing else, and to dismiss anything other than the government's narratives on COVID and on mandates, and on lockdowns and on masks and on social distancing.
It seems...
So I said, well, you better stop this recording, because if your boss finds out you've just said this to me. She said, I'm with you, Russell. She said, I'm with you. And I said, well, you better delete this recording, because if your boss finds out, you'll be out of a job.
I think that's a very sad situation.
No, but where are those investigative journalists now? And this comes back to that whole misinformation, disinformation. Those journalists now are around the world on social media. They're getting their own programs out all over the place.
Well, they won't be soon with these sort of laws.
That's right. You'd only have to mention vaccines and you'll be off the air.
Well, we'll see how we go with this.
Yeah, you'll be off the air. So that's where we stand. And, we're here. Most Australians live in the capital cities, controlled by the capital cities, and the votes in the parliament are controlled by the capital cities. And in Victoria, there's only about 1.5 million people that live outside of the metropolitan area.
That's it. Yeah. That is the big problem. But
all the policies are attuned to those people where they're going to get the most votes. It's crazy stuff. So, the Western Australia, in my opinion, in rural Western Australia and rural Australia, we are most disadvantaged, because even though the Liberals have more representatives in regional areas than any other party, we're still dominated by what happens in those cities.
Of course, but our Constitution does provide a solution to that. It's called Chapter 6, New States. So the only thing I can recommend is everyone in the regional areas start thinking about, well, divorcing Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in particular, and creating their own states and making their own decisions. But that's another issue.
Well, that would cross across one vote, one value, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, one vote, one value in our system. Well, a state's a state. It just makes up its own mind what it does if it's separate. But the other thing is, do you think it is time maybe we had a referendum on free speech? I mean, referendum is the flavour of the month at the moment. Not exactly on the item that I'd care to talk about, but do you think it is becoming necessary to enshrine free speech in our constitution somehow as a means to sort of stop this rot?
Well, you shouldn't have to, because we're having a referendum on free speech now through this misinformation, disinformation bill. That's exactly what's happening. We're going to decide in the Parliament, and we are going to do our very, very, very best to bring to light what the Human Rights Commissioner said. It undermines democracy, erodes public trust and jeopardises free speech in Australia. And that is un-Australian. Of all the things that we're known for, it is our free speech. It is the fact that I remember Albie Schultz, the former member for Hume, the late Albie Schultz, stood up in Parliament and said, I don't agree with what Russell Broadbent's saying, but I'll stand here for the whole of my time that I get to speak to say to you that he has a right to say it. Right? And he said that in the Australian Parliament. Now, Albie was a meat worker, and he was a very strong advocate for regional Australia, particularly his own area of New South Wales. But you know, there was a man that could tear me limb from limb if he wanted to, barehanded. And he stood there and he said, I will support Russell in whatever he wants to say in this House, because freedom of speech is more important than anything else we do. That's Albie Schultz. Now, he didn't support me on that motion, which we got through, and it was a private member's motion. They don't often happen. I won't go into what it was, because we haven't got time. But Albie Schultz came into the Parliament on purpose and said, I demand to speak. And he said, free speech in this country is more important than anything else we do. And that's why we have parliamentary privilege as well. So you can get up in the Parliament and you can speak to something without being sued.
On that note, we're running out of time on this meeting. I think that's a great note to finish off with. Look, I'd like to really thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. I hope we can come back to you after at least this is more discussed in the Parliament, and we have some good positive feedback that this thing's got to be overturned. Thank you, Russell. If you've enjoyed today's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Join me again on Wednesday evening for another interview. This time it will be with Dean Hurstel. He is the Vice President of Council Watch, and we'll be discussing the role of councils and the problems within councils. So please join us again.